Hello, I'm Dr. Deborah Richardson Phillips, and I am the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at St. Ignatius High School, Cleveland. Thank you so much for joining me for this session today. I'll be discussing diversity and inclusion strategic planning and how your organization may be able to move from compliance to consciousness. Before I start, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. I'm a proud graduate of Winston-Salem State University, a historically Black college in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. While in college, I played basketball. I also pledged my sorority Delta Sigma Theta. Both of my graduate degrees, my master's in public administration and my PhD in human development, are from the University of Delaware. In the middle here, you'll see this beautiful picture, Walk by Faith, because my faith is so very important to me. And I thought it fitting to have it sit in the middle of all of my identities. Down in this corner, you'll see DEI surrounded by a number of states. These are the states where I have had the pleasure of doing DEI work as a faculty member, as an administrator at the collegiate level, and also in corporate America. Here, this picture of my family, this is really my heartbeat. These are the folks who support me as I do this fantastic work, the work that I love every day. My husband, Kirk, my son, Nathan, my daughter, Monet, and these are my parents. Here you'll see a medical symbol. My mother is a retired epidemiologist, and a very interesting picture here of a football field with trees growing in the middle of it. My father is played in the NFL, so for the Buffalo Bills, and he was a Division I football coach. So I really grew up a lot like these trees in the middle of football fields. Here you'll see one of my favorite poems. I'm stronger because I had to be. I'm smarter because of my mistakes, happier because of the sadness I've known, and now wiser because I learned. Before we talk about strategic planning, I think it's important to talk just a little bit about the evolution of this work. People often think it's recent. People think this work started right as COVID hit. Folks think maybe we've only been doing this for a few years, but that's absolutely incorrect. This work has been around for some time. In the 1960s, certainly this was the civil rights era. So this was considered the civil rights movement, civil rights movement's kind of commitment to DEI. This is when the US government began to formally address the historic discrimination. And specifically, they were looking at education, they were looking at employment and housing, and the dimensions of diversity that they focused on were race, color, national origin, religion, and gender. In the 70s, certainly, we started talking about affirmative action. This is when hiring and promotion practices actually were mandated. We started talking about quotas at this point. How many people do you have? We realized that that was a problem because we started creating this revolving door. So we were getting people in, but for some reason we weren't managing to get them to stay. So in the 90s, we started talking about, and let me back up just a moment. In the 80s, certainly the focus was on protected classes, anti-discrimination laws, so those protected classes. In the 90s, then there was this management of diversity because again, there's this revolving door, and now we're starting to manage it. So what we see is diversity is widely accepted and it's recognized as an opportunity, but now because we see this recognized as revolving door, it's also then becoming a problem. So in 2000, we started creating strategic plans around how do we get people in, how do we create this sense of belonging, and then how do we commit to some sort of sustainability for the DEI work. The initial assessment is important as you begin to think about creating a strategic plan. Certainly it will create a baseline for you and it'll allow you to gather pertinent data. It'll certainly help you begin to get buy-in from your communities and your key stakeholders. We've talked about at some point this continuum, and at one end, certainly there are those folks who've been waiting for you to arrive. They are eager to join your efforts. At the other end are those folks who don't think you are needed. The product is good. We don't need this individual or focus because they feel like it's divisive. And in the middle, and this is where you really want to focus your efforts, in the middle, there's this group of folks who are waiting. They are indifferent. They will follow a plan, an efficient and effective plan if it's laid out, but they're waiting to see what will the commitment to DEI look like for the organization. It's also important to know at this point in your assessment, it is certainly your responsibility to plant the seed, but you are not obligated certainly to change minds. Often this is where people begin to go down a rabbit hole as they're trying to figure out who's on board. It guides the work. It certainly provides information for customizing your training and professional development efforts, and then it'll allow you to measure the progress of your initiative. At the bottom here, you'll see 2 assessment methods. I think it's important to mention those just briefly. I find qualitative data, qualitative or narrative research is very effective in education. It allows you to create a picture or provide a framework for the work. It allows you to talk about the feelings associated with inclusion and equity in your space, and that will resonate with those communities. I find in corporate America, what is important is the quantitative data, the bottom line. When I did work in corporate America, and I tried to create this narrative, this is why people are leaving. This is why we are spending enormous resources creating great employees for someone else. We're really a training ground. That didn't resonate. But when I said, this is the revolving door that we've created, and as a result of it, the bottom line is it is costing you $500,000 annually to replace key personnel, all of a sudden they got it. The last piece, the organizational audit, generally is an opportunity for you to partner with an external firm to have them come in and assess your existing policies and procedures. Compliance audit. Really, we are just talking about your organization following the law, regulations, having standards, doing this work ethically. Here, that data that I was referring to is representation driven, and often low to moderate numbers are actually what drives your efforts, and it's one dimensional. You only focus when you look across or you span your organizational chart, what you are finding is, wow, we don't have a lot of women. Wow, we don't have a lot of people of color, and you zone in on that marginalized group. It's important here also that you have authentic conversations with a team, and you say, this is our dominant culture. If you are unable to assess accurately your dominant culture, your DEI efforts will certainly be off target. Programming is very basic, and what that means is you will do things around MLK, Women's History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, and you'll check the box. Okay, we did that. You have a non-discrimination statement. Your employee professional development is minimal. Often it is something like unconscious bias training, and you think, okay, we get it now, we're fixed, we don't need to revisit this anymore. And then you have few dedicated personnel and resources. Again, an opportunity to check the box. When you transition to a cultural audit, certainly you take that compliance data into consideration, but your thinking in this space evolves. And your thinking becomes centered around equity and inclusion. And so that data is very different. And it's around employee and student retention, that sense of belonging, overall satisfaction that people have. You also pull in HR statistics. If you don't have an HR department, please identify someone to pull this data for you. And the data here I'm referring to is the amount of time that employees are using sick time, they're using PTO time, whether or not you have employees who are on performance plans. Often that will suggest within marginalized communities that they are unhappy in the space. And so please gather that data as well. There's a lot of research out there, and I can certainly share that with you offline, that supports employees' work, performance, and attendance, to their identification to marginalized groups and their sense of belonging or inclusion in your community. Certainly look at your landscape and be honest about how you look, not who you are, right? This is not an opportunity to say our dominant community or culture is racist, right? Because that's not what we're talking about. But really take a visual of your representation and what do you look like. Look at your workforce. Take a walk around your campus. Look in your bookstore. What groups, what people are represented if you have cards. Go to your dining hall and figure out what foods are being offered. And again, expand your understanding of diversity and inclusion, expand the full breadth and include all dimensions of diversity. And if you do that, it'll allow you to intimately enter into a variety of spaces from a DEI lens. And so look at who you are. A quick example of that, and often the lack of awareness, right? This is not about intent or impact, but the lack of awareness. My son attended a Christian elementary school, and he came home one day in first or second grade, and he said, "Hey, Mom, Mommy, where do Black people go when they die?" And I thought that was an odd question. So I said, "Nathan, where did you get that? Why are you asking Mommy that question?" And he said, "Because at school there are white angels, and so I want to know where Black people go when they die." And that was certainly an opportunity for my husband and I to visit the school and have a fruitful conversation about my son's observations, the messages they were sending to students of color, and allowed us to donate diverse art to the school, right? So look at the landscape. Consider your language, verbal, nonverbal, the acronyms you use, the nuances, the cadence, how you communicate. You may find that your organization, the culture, is very passive aggressive when it comes to this particular topic. So you'll want to make sure you identify all of those things. Certainly recruitment, give you an opportunity to do some forecasting. When you know someone in a particular area is going to retire or is unhappy and it appears as if they may leave, you want to begin to plan your recruiting efforts. And certainly there you'll want to use that opportunity as you're waiting this person's exit to develop external relationships that allow you to do some recruiting for diversity when you need those things. Hiring, who gets shortlisted, who gets interviewed, hired, and why, your policies, procedures, and practices. Certainly, authentic relationships are important in this space. Who you trust, who feels like they belong, and then the narrative. Developing this strategic plan is just that, excuse me, it's strategic and it's intentional. Certainly, this work is tied to mission. Your work in this DEI space must start there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the documents and supporting text for this work, but it has to start with mission. There has to be a vision from your leadership team, from your board around this work, and certainly anything you do must align with those things. The core components of a DEI diversity plan should be recruitment, it should be policies, it should be hiring at mission, you should be looking at retention, you should also be looking at curriculum. Communication, you need to create common language, and I'll talk about that more in just a second. And then you also need to communicate your efforts internally and externally. You need to be absolutely transparent about this work. Often, the naysayers and the folks who are in the middle of kind of that continuum I referred to, left unsaid, those folks will create their own narrative. So left to their own devices, they may create something that does not support your particular efforts. So you're going to want to make sure that you are transparent and you articulate your efforts. Implementation of a strategic plan. Certainly you're talking about the goals, and I'll talk about those in a moment. Your objectives, key task and action items, the programming, how you're going to measure your success, and a timeline is very important. We are going to accomplish this by this date. I encourage you to be realistic, to be intentional, and to be strategic. Doing this work and doing it wrong, doing this work, work that lacks intentionality is as bad as not doing the work at all. Please do not make commitments that your organization cannot sustain. And then the strategies for addressing some challenges that you may identify, potential and existing challenges, and certainly create a gap closure plan. Definitions, I talked about that. Creating this common language is important. So here I've kind of thrown up just a few definitions. You'll find that you can define these in many ways. One I like to use is that diversity is a unique set of qualities that can separate or connect individuals. And here I've identified what in my area we call the big eight. So that's race and it's gender and it's religion. It's physical and mental abilities, it's sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity. So please keep in mind that race and ethnicity are two very different concepts. They are not interchangeable. And certainly gender and sexual representation are also very different, and they are not interchangeable concepts. Inclusion refers to the state of how people feel they're being treated in your space. It's about how they feel in your environment. It's about whether or not they feel valued, respected, appreciated, and heard, right? Heard is very different does not mean that there's an obligation to then comply or implement. Those are two different things, but people like to feel heard. And doesn't mean that because you heard me, you're going to do what I said, but it certainly means that you will take it into advisement as you begin to do this work. Equity is just around fairness and justice, and it's displayed in the manner in which people are treated. Again, diversity, you can define it in many ways. When you come up with these definitions, it should be broad enough to include everyone in your organization, yet specific enough to securely attach to your mission. I can't tell you enough how important it is to tie this work to your mission. Please consider your culture, the culture of the organization. Please also understand that there could be a primary culture and then subcultures, which really makes this work difficult. So, for example, at St. Ignatius, while we are creating this overarching culture around equity and inclusion, because that is our focus, not diversity, right? So my sense is diversity is a byproduct of these things. If you are equitable and inclusive, diversity will happen. It will come, right? So here, while we are creating this overarching cultural narrative, there may be subcultures within departments, which makes sometimes this a little difficult to navigate. And definition must coincide again with the overall mission. Your goal. Why are you doing this work? This too is very important, that you have this conversation with your leadership team, your board, and the group, the team responsible for implementing this work. Are you really truly looking to be inclusive? Are you really wanting people to assimilate? So whoever it is, the dominant culture is, you're asking people to come in and be exactly like those folks. Are you segregated? So folks can come in, diversity we certainly open our doors. We have this non-discrimination statement, but you're really not a part of who we are. And certainly there's integration. You're here, but you're still not part of the system. And then certainly there's exclusion. So we don't want you here at all. So it's important for your organization to figure out where it is you are. Again, when I talked about the primary culture and subcultures, you may find that for your organization, integration may be where you are right now in this moment. So there is some diversity there, but folks aren't really feeling settled. And this is where you are trying to get to this point of inclusion. You need to define your goals. So what is it you're trying to do? Goals should be, you should stretch your organization, but they must not be impossible to meet, right? So you want to stretch yourself. You want to move beyond your comfort zone, but you don't want to move so far, so quickly that what you're doing is not achievable. So what do goals look like? Indicate some success measures. What are we going to look like when? Indicate how it's going to be measured. Clearly state when it's going to be accomplished. So we talked about that timeline. Identify who's responsible for it. And then identify the consequences or rewards associated with these goals. Some examples are, we're going to increase our representation. We're going to increase our retention rates. We're going to increase the number of underrepresented individuals, maybe their professional development plans. We're going to create affinity groups within our organizations. We're going to increase the number of hires. We're going to increase our board diversity. So those are just some examples of some goals that you may set for your organization. How do you maintain accountability? Leadership must hold itself accountable for the success. Once you identify the goals, your leadership team on a regular basis should be revisiting those goals. And certainly there needs to be an annual review. Your leadership also needs to hold your organization accountable. And so that means annually you're pulling that data. What does our hiring look like? What does our retention look like? Again, does us no good if we're spending all of this money and all this effort bringing folks in, but we remain consistent. So we are consistently at 27% diversity. But that's because even though we have this huge recruiting class, we bring in 30%, but we lose 10%. So our efforts certainly plateau. Look at your curriculum. And then how are you caring for people? So cure personalis is certainly caring for the whole person, but are you caring for everyone? And then what does engagement look like? And your recruiting and hiring, is there cultural competence? These things should be considered for all of your candidates as you think about your hiring practices. One of the things that we did this year at St. Ignatius High School is that not only did we pull a diverse cross-functional interview team together, but we ask a DEI question of every for individual we brought into interview. So everyone that we interviewed, we ask a DEI question, the same DEI question. And then all organizations should have your employees establish some sort of performance goal. So how do you sustain this work? Certainly in the middle here, you see sustainability. So there's some pieces that must be in place in order for you to sustain the work. An aligned vision. So you have to know where you're going and you have to authentically be able to articulate that to your community. Continuous learning. So again, it's not the check the box, we did unconscious bias training, but it is moving beyond that, that entry level of training. You have to have sufficient resources. Do you have personnel committed to doing this work? Certainly this work is difficult. This work was difficult before this particular moment of racial unrest in our country. You need to identify someone who is responsible and accountable for this work, who is responsible for keeping it on your leadership team's radar. The same way you hire a principal, the same way you hire someone to oversee discipline, the same way you hire someone to oversee athletics. Someone needs to be responsible for this work. The other piece that I might add is this individual needs to have a seat at the table. This individual needs to have the ear of your leadership team. Often in corporate America, what we will look at when we look at an organization, when I do assessments and I look at an organizational chart, I am looking at depth. Where does the DEI person sit? And on your organizational chart, the further down the DEI individual, the less important the initiative appears to be. So if your DEI person reports to an assistant principal, who reports to a principal, who reports to a president, on your organizational chart, again, that the DEI initiative appears to be very low. So that individual needs to have direct access to your president and your board. Your organization's relationships, both internal and external, are important. Regular assessment. Annually, you need to be revisiting where are we? And I'll talk potentially during the talk back about what revisiting that looks like. And then certainly communication is important. Finally, I want to share best practices. Again, I cannot say enough. Please align your diversity efforts with your mission and create a vision. Allocate resources, manpower, and money. You need resources to do this work, financial resources to do this work effectively. Conduct diversity inclusion training, key components, knowledge, awareness, skills, action. Establish a DEI leadership council or a diversity team, again, a group, a cross-functional group that will come together to do this work. Establish affinity groups if needed in your space. Create a diversity recruiting plan. When will we need people? And again, this speaks to your forecasting. We are looking at people not graduating. We're looking, so we're going to do some recruiting for our high schools. Where are we getting those students from? What parishes are diverse? Again, think about the full breadth of diversity. So here I'm not referring to just Black and brown people. Who diversifies your community? If you're talking about employees, certainly you want to begin to develop relationships with diverse external organizations that can help you recruit. Communicate that the organization has a DEI commitment, and then hold the community accountable. Supporting documents that we are using at St. Ignatius High School to do this work. Again, this work is driven by the gospel. It is driven by Catholic social teaching. It is driven by Grad at Grad, and certainly tied to our mission. So we're certainly using scripture like Galatians 3:28. We are using 1 John 4:20. We're looking at 1 Corinthians 16:14, and then Matthew 25:45. Catholic social teaching. Absolutely, this work is embedded in that work. I want to also add here that there is particular attention paid to the poor and vulnerable within the Catholic social teachings. In addition to looking at that particular population, St. Ignatius is also paying particular attention to marginalized groups who may not be resource deficient. Certainly recognizing the role that race plays in accessibility and opportunity. We are looking at groups that may have resources but still don't feel like they are included or belong in our particular population. Certainly our text being the Bible, St. Ignatius High School mission, Grad at Grad, Catholic social teaching, and what makes a Jesuit school Jesuit. I want to thank you for joining me. I know that was a lot. I certainly appreciate you taking the time to be with me. I hope that you are interested in learning more or having more dialogue. If so, please join me for the talk back on October 19th at 9 p.m. Thank you again for this opportunity, and thank you for joining me.